Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most fascinating and darkest chapters. Imagine this. It's the year 1767 in Amsterdam. A man has been pulled from the canal, lifeless, cold, his skin already turning blue. Everyone knows he's dead. But then something impossible happens. His chest begins to rise. His fingers twitch. Within the hour, he's sitting up, confused, but very much alive. Here's the question that haunted medieval doctors for centuries. When someone stops breathing, stops moving, grows cold to the touch, are they truly dead? Or is death just sleeping? You know, I'm really glad you're here with me tonight. Before we dive deeper into this story, and trust me, what you're about to hear will change how you think about life, death, and everything our ancestors believed. I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like if you're enjoying it so far. Or hey, even if you're just curious about where this is going, and I'm genuinely curious, where are you right now? Lying in bed in New York, sitting on a couch in California, wherever you are, drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one. And I love knowing that we're sharing this moment together across time and space. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's step back into a world where death wasn't always the end. Here's something most people don't realize about medieval times. They didn't see death the way we do today. When someone's heart stops, we understand it. Brain death, cellular breakdown, the irreversible shutdown of biological systems. It's scientific, it's final. But in medieval Europe from roughly 500 to 1500 AD, death was negotiable, flexible, something that could maybe, just maybe, be bargained with, reversed, or even outright defeated. Let me paint you a picture. It's a cold morning in 14th century France. A woman collapses in the market square. Her breathing stops. Her pulse vanishes. The crowd gathers, whispering prayers, certain she's gone. But the local physician rushes over and begins his work. Not to comfort the grieving, but to bring her back. He checks her skin temperature. He holds a mirror to her lips, looking for the faintest fog of breath. He lifts her eyelids, searching for signs of life in pupils that might still respond to light. Because here's what he believes. She might not be dead at all. She might just be mostly dead. This wasn't ignorance or superstition talking. Well, okay, maybe some of it was superstition, but there was also genuine observation behind it. Medieval people saw things we rarely witness today. They saw drowning victims suddenly cough up water and revive. They saw people collapse from extreme cold, appear completely lifeless, only to wake hours later by a fire. They saw plague victims declared dead, prepared for burial, who suddenly gasped and opened their eyes. Without our modern understanding of hypothermia, comas, or catalepsy, how else would you explain these resurrections except to believe that death itself had layers? Enter one of the most important concepts in medieval medicine, the difference between what they called apparent death and absolute death. This distinction was formally articulated by an English physician named James Curry in 1792. Technically just past the medieval period, but building on centuries of medieval thinking, Curry wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here, "In apparent death, the vital principle only lies dormant and may be roused back into action. The person completely restored to life and health. In absolute death, that principle is completely extinguished." Think about what that means. They believed humans possess something, a vital spark, a life force. Maybe what we'd call a soul that could flicker like a candle in the wind, but not necessarily go out. And if you could fan that flame, if you could catch it before it vanished completely, you could bring someone back from the very edge of oblivion. Now, where did this belief come from? Well, if you're a medieval European, you grew up hearing stories that absolutely reinforce this worldview. Open any Bible and you'll find them. There's the story of the prophet Elijah in the first book of Kings. A widow's son dies. No breathing, no heartbeat, dead. Elijah stretches himself upon the child 3 times, crying out to God, and the boy's life returns to him. He wakes up. Then there's Elisha in the second book of Kings, performing what might be history's first recorded mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. A child dies, and Elisha put his mouth upon his mouth, and his eyes upon his eyes, and his hands upon his hands, basically describing what we'd recognize as CPR. And the child sneezes 7 times and opens his eyes. These weren't just stories. They were proof, divine proof, that death could be reversed, that the right intervention at the right moment could call someone back from beyond. And if God's prophets could do it with prayer and touch, why couldn't doctors do it with medicine and skill? This created a fascinating and sometimes tragic collision between faith and early medicine. Medieval physicians existed in this strange space where they were expected to be both scientists and miracle workers. They studied ancient texts from Greek and Roman physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. They learned about anatomy, about herbs, about the stars' influence on health. But they also blessed their medicines, prayed over patients, and genuinely believed that their healing was an extension of God's power working through human hands. There's a beautiful or maybe heartbreaking optimism in that worldview. Every doctor was in some sense attempting miracles. Every treatment was a prayer made physical. When they placed leeches on a feverish patient, they weren't just balancing humors. They were fighting death itself, trying to pull someone back from that threshold between apparent and absolute death. And you know what? Sometimes it worked. Not for the reasons they thought, of course. That fever patient might have recovered because their immune system kicked in, not because of the leeches. But they didn't know about immune systems. What they knew was patient dying, apply treatment, patient lives, therefore death defeated, victory. But here's where it gets darker. Because this belief that death could be cheated, that the right intervention could reverse the irreversible, led medieval doctors down some truly horrifying paths. If you believe someone hovering at death's door can be saved, you'll try anything. And I mean anything. Imagine you're a medieval physician and a wealthy merchant comes to you. His daughter is dying, burning with fever, barely conscious. Or think you know that her humors are catastrophically unbalanced. Her body is flooded with corrupted blood. So you make an incision in her arm and let that bad blood drain out. You watch her grow weaker, paler, her pulse thinner. But the medical texts you studied, written by authorities who'd practiced for centuries, say this is how you save her. So you keep going. You drain more and more. Because stopping might mean admitting that death is winning and death isn't supposed to win. That daughter might die from blood loss rather than fever. But in the doctor's mind, he was fighting to the very end, trying every technique in his arsenal to snatch her back from that terrible threshold. This is the tragedy of medieval medicine, the burning desire to cure death, combined with almost none of the knowledge needed to actually do it. But let's go back to that moment in Amsterdam I mentioned at the start, because it's one of the most important turning points in this entire story. The year is 1767, and something revolutionary is happening. A group of concerned citizens has formed what they call the Society for the Recovery of Drowned Persons. Amsterdam, crisscrossed by canals, was seeing people drown regularly. And these society members started noticing something. Some drowned people could be revived if you acted fast enough. They began developing actual techniques. Warm the body, try to create artificial breathing by manipulating the chest. Within 4 years, they claimed to have saved over 150 people. News of their success spread like wildfire through Europe. Similar societies popped up in Hamburg, Venice, Milan, Vienna, Paris, London. People began to realize that apparent death was real, that there was a window of time where intervention could bring someone back. This wasn't medieval anymore. We're well into the Enlightenment by 1767. But it was built on that medieval foundation, that refusal to accept death as immediately absolute. The difference. Now they were starting to figure out what actually worked. And that's the bridge we're standing on tonight. Medieval doctors believed passionately that death could be defeated. They just had almost everything wrong about how to do it. They thought it was about balancing mystical fluids in the body, about appeasing angry humors, about applying bizarre concoctions and performing rituals that sometimes helped but often hurt. But here's what they got right. The human instinct to fight for life, to refuse to give up, to keep trying even when it seems hopeless. That instinct, misguided as it often was in medieval hands, eventually evolved into modern emergency medicine, into CPR, into defibrillators, into all the ways we actually can today bring people back from clinical death. The medieval doctors who tried to cure death weren't fools. They were pioneers stumbling through darkness, guided by flickering candlelight, doing their best with tools that were woefully inadequate for the task. They saved some lives through sheer determination and lucky guesses. They lost many, many more through techniques we now recognize as disastrous, but they never stopped trying. They never accepted that death had to have the final word. And in that persistence, however misguided, lies the seed of every medical advancement that came after. So when you think about medieval medicine, don't just think about the horror stories, the bloodletting, and the bizarre cures we'll explore deeper in our next part. Think about the hope underneath it all, the belief that life is precious enough to fight for even against impossible odds. Even when you don't know what you're doing, even when everything you try seems to fail. That hope, that refusal to surrender to death, is the most human thing about us. And it echoes across centuries from those medieval physicians bending over dying patients with prayer and primitive medicine all the way to modern emergency rooms where doctors still fight death with everything they have, just with better tools and better knowledge now. But to understand how badly things could go wrong, how that noble desire to defeat death led to some of the most nightmarish treatments in medical history, we need to understand the foundation everything else was built on. We need to talk about a theory that dominated medicine for nearly 2,000 years, that sent countless people to early graves, even as doctors tried desperately to save them. We need to talk about the 4 humors. And trust me, when you understand how deeply medieval doctors believed in this completely wrong theory, when you see how it shaped every single treatment they prescribed, that's when the true tragedy of medieval medicine becomes clear. That's when you realize these weren't cruel people. They were people trying to help, armed with information that was catastrophically incorrect. So settle in deeper, because what comes next gets complicated, fascinating, and yes, sometimes absolutely brutal. We're about to explore the very foundation of medieval medical thinking. The theory that convinced brilliant, caring physicians to do terrible things in the name of healing. The 4 humors await, and they're stranger than you might imagine. So, there's this moment, and I think about it often, where everything in medicine went wrong for about 2,000 years. Not because people were stupid, not because they didn't care, but because one brilliant Greek physician had an idea that made so much sense, was so beautifully logical that nobody thought to question whether it was actually true. Picture ancient Greece around 400 BCE. A physician named Hippocrates, yes, the father of medicine, the guy whose oath doctors still take, is observing his patients. He notices that when people are sick, different fluids seem to be involved. Someone with a cold has lots of phlegm. Someone with a fever might vomit up yellowish bile. Wounded soldiers bleed red blood. People with certain temperaments seem melancholic, dark, weighed down by something invisible. Hippocrates starts connecting dots. He's living in a world that believes everything is made of four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. So he thinks, what if the human body also has four fundamental fluids? Four humors that need to be kept in perfect balance. And just like that, a theory is born. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Four fluids that supposedly determined everything about you. Your health, your personality, even your destiny. Now here's where it gets interesting. About 500 years later, a Roman physician named Galen takes Hippocrates' idea and runs with it. I mean, this guy goes all in. He creates this elaborate system where each humor is linked to a specific organ, a season, a temperature, even a personality type. Blood comes from the heart. It's hot and wet, associated with spring. And if you have too much blood, you're sanguine, optimistic, social, maybe a little impulsive. Phlegm comes from the brain. It's cold and wet, linked to winter. And excess phlegm makes you phlegmatic, calm, sluggish, unemotional. Yellow bile from the liver makes you choleric, hot-tempered, ambitious, fiery, and black bile from the spleen. Oh, black bile is the troublemaker. Too much of it makes you melancholic, depressed, anxious, prone to dark thoughts. Can you see how elegant this seems? How perfectly it all fits together? Every personality, every illness, every mood swing, all explained by the balance of four fluids. It's like a unified theory of everything human. There's just one tiny problem. Black bile doesn't exist. I mean, the other three, blood, phlegm, actual yellow bile from the gallbladder, those are real bodily fluids. But black bile, nobody has ever found it. Not in Galen's time, not in medieval times, not now. It was a theoretical fluid invented to complete the pattern, to make the math work out. And yet, for the next 1,500 years, doctors would diagnose and treat patients based on balancing a substance that never existed in the first place. Think about that for a second. Imagine going to a doctor today and being told you're sick because you have too much of a fluid that isn't real. It sounds absurd, right? But here's the thing, and this is crucial. It didn't sound absurd to medieval doctors because the theory worked sort of sometimes enough to keep people believing. Let me show you how this played out. It's winter 1320 somewhere in England. A woman, let's call her Eleanor, comes to the local physician complaining of deep sadness. She can't sleep. She has no appetite. Nothing brings her joy anymore. The doctor examines her. He checks her pulse. Slow, weak. He looks at her urine, dark, cloudy. He asks about her diet, her dreams, the positions of the planets when she was born, and then he nods knowingly. Excess black bile, he declares. A classic case of melancholia. Now, what Eleanor probably has is what we'd call clinical depression. Maybe she's grieving. Maybe it's seasonal affective disorder. It is winter after all, and vitamin D deficiency is real. Maybe it's postpartum depression or hormonal imbalance. But the doctor doesn't know about neurotransmitters or hormones or vitamins. What he knows is the four humors, so he prescribes treatments designed to reduce black bile and increase blood. He recommends bloodletting. We'll talk much more about that horror in our next section. He suggests she eat warm, moist foods. He might prescribe a purgative to empty her bowels, thinking that will expel the excess bile. And here's the tragic part. Sometimes Eleanor might actually feel a bit better. Not because the treatment worked as intended, but because she's getting attention. Because someone cared enough to try to help. Because the placebo effect is powerful, or simply because time passes and depression sometimes lifts on its own. The doctor notes her improvement in his records. Reduced black bile through proper balancing of humors. Patient recovered. The theory is reinforced. This cycle continues. But what about when patients didn't improve? What about when they got worse or died? Well, that was rarely the theory's fault. The doctor might say the imbalance was too severe or we intervened too late. Or, and this is key, the stars were not properly aligned for treatment. Because remember, medieval medicine wasn't just about fluids. It was intertwined with astrology, with religion, with cosmic forces beyond human control. There was always something else to blame. This is how a wrong theory can persist for centuries. It's flexible enough to explain success, and sophisticated enough to excuse failure. It's a closed system, self-reinforcing, unfalsifiable. Now you might be wondering, didn't anyone notice this wasn't working? Didn't anyone think to, I don't know, actually look inside a body and check if black bile was really there? Here's where the story gets even more fascinating. Some people did question it. During the Islamic Golden Age, roughly 800 to 1300 CE, physicians like Avicenna were making incredible advances in medicine. Avicenna wrote the Canon of Medicine, this massive 5-volume encyclopedia that became the medical textbook for centuries. It was translated from Arabic into Latin and used in European universities well into the 1600s. We're talking about 700 years of medical students learning from this one text. And Avicenna, brilliant as he was, doubled down on the 4 humors. He refined Galen's work, made it even more complex and elaborate. He added layers of theory about how the humors interacted, how they could be balanced through specific combinations of medicines. The canon became so authoritative that questioning it was almost heresy. Medical schools made students memorize vast passages. Professors built their entire careers on interpreting and elaborating on Avicenna's words. Picture a medical school in 13th century Bologna, one of the first universities in Europe. Students sit on hard wooden benches. No electricity, lit by candles or daylight streaming through narrow windows. A professor reads from a massive Latin translation of Avicenna's canon. He doesn't demonstrate. He doesn't dissect. He doesn't experiment. He reads, explains, and expects students to memorize. Medical education was about learning texts, not about observing bodies, theory over practice, authority over evidence. And you know what's heartbreaking? These were smart people. These medieval physicians genuinely wanted to help. They studied for years. They memorized complex theories. They learned to identify dozens of pulse variations, to analyze urine in 30 different ways to track planetary movements. They worked hard. They cared deeply. They were just wrong. Wrong about the fundamental nature of illness. Wrong about how the body works. And because they were trained to trust ancient authority over their own observations, they couldn't see it. Let me give you another example. This one even more specific. There's a documented case from 1348 during the Black Death. A physician in Avignon named Guy de Chauliac, actually a pretty famous surgeon for his time, is treating plague victims. He writes in his journal about trying to balance the humors of dying patients. He's bleeding them, purging them, trying to expel the corrupted humors causing their illness. And they're dying anyway, thousands of them. The streets are filled with corpses. The plague is killing between 30 to 60% of Europe's population over the next few years. And Guy de Chauliac watching this horror unfold, treating patient after patient who dies despite his best efforts. Does he question the theory? Does he think maybe we have this completely wrong? No. He writes that the plague is caused by a catastrophic corruption of all four humors, simultaneously made worse by planetary conjunctions and possibly divine punishment. The theory absorbs this massive failure and emerges unchanged. Because when your explanatory framework is that flexible, nothing can disprove it. Here's a question for you lying there listening to this. If you lived in 1350 and everyone you respected, every doctor, every professor, every book told you the four humors were real, would you believe them? Of course you would. We all would. We believe what we're taught by authorities, especially when it comes wrapped in complex technical language we don't fully understand. Medieval physicians weren't gullible. They were products of their educational system just like we are. But let's talk about the human cost of this wrong theory because that's what really matters. Every diagnosis of excess black bile was a missed opportunity to understand depression. Every imbalance of humors was actually an infection, a vitamin deficiency, a parasite, a tumor, an autoimmune disease. Real conditions with real causes that could potentially be treated if only doctors knew what they were actually dealing with. Imagine a child with what we'd now recognize as type 1 diabetes. The symptoms are there. Excessive thirst, frequent urination, weight loss, fatigue. The medieval doctor examines the child's urine. Yes, it tastes sweet. They actually did taste it and diagnoses an excess of yellow bile making the blood too hot and thin. The treatment more bloodletting to reduce the excess blood volume, cooling foods, maybe some herbs. The child's condition worsens. Their body is literally starving at a cellular level because it can't process glucose without insulin. But the doctor just sees humoral imbalance. The child dies. The doctor notes humoral corruption too advanced patient could not be saved, and the same treatment is applied to the next diabetic child who comes along or consider epilepsy. Seizures were thought to be caused by excess phlegm flowing into the brain. So doctors would prescribe extreme purging, vomiting, diarrhea, anything to expel that imaginary phlegm. They might drill a hole in the skull. Yes, we'll get to that nightmare in a later section to let the bad humors escape. The seizures continue because they're actually caused by abnormal electrical activity in the brain. But the theory says it's phlegm, so treatments target phlegm, and patients suffer needlessly. The saddest part, medieval doctors noticed that some treatments seem to help certain patients. If someone with an actual infection happened to be given herbs that had antibacterial properties, they might recover. The doctor would credit proper humoral balancing. The antibiotic properties of the herb were working, but the doctor's understanding of why it worked was completely wrong. Right result, wrong reason. And because they didn't understand the real mechanism, they couldn't consistently replicate success. It's like if I told you that cars run on the souls of sleeping hamsters and you believed me and your car started every morning, you'd think my hamster soul theory was correct? The car runs. Therefore, hamster souls must be real. You wouldn't think to look under the hood to see the actual engine. That's medieval medicine in a nutshell. By the 1400s and 1500s, as we edge toward the Renaissance, tiny cracks start appearing in this edifice. A few bold physicians begin to suggest that maybe, just maybe, direct observation of the body matters more than ancient texts. Andreas Vesalius starts doing systematic dissections, illegal and controversial at the time, and publishes detailed anatomical drawings in 1543. And guess what? He doesn't find black bile. Not in the spleen, not anywhere. But even Vesalius struggles to fully break free from humoral theory. It's too deeply embedded in how everyone thinks about the body. The four humors finally truly died in the 1600s and 1700s. Killed by the scientific method, by systematic observation, by controlled experiments that showed the theory simply didn't hold up under scrutiny. But think about how long that took. 2,000 years. 2 millennia of medicine built on a beautiful, logical, completely incorrect foundation. And the ghost of the four humors still haunts our language today. When we say someone is sanguine or phlegmatic or choleric or melancholic, we're using vocabulary from this long-dead medical theory. It's embedded in our culture so deeply that most people don't even realize these words originated from a belief about magical fluids in the body. So what's the lesson here? I think it's about the danger of trusting elegant theories over messy reality. The four humors made perfect philosophical sense. It fit the cosmology of the time. It explained everything. But it was wrong. And because it was wrong, countless people suffered and died from treatable conditions that doctors misunderstood. Medieval physicians did their best. They really did. But they were trapped in a paradigm that prevented them from seeing what was actually happening inside their patients. They were sincere, educated, dedicated, and catastrophically mistaken. And that brings us to the most visceral, disturbing manifestation of this mistaken theory. Because if you believe illness is caused by excess bodily fluids, there's one treatment that seems obviously correct. Get rid of the excess, drain it out, let it flow away, and restore balance. What could possibly go wrong with that logic? Well, as we're about to discover, just about everything, because the single most common treatment in medieval medicine prescribed for fevers, for plague, for depression, for headaches, for almost every ailment imaginable, was also one of the deadliest. It's time to talk about bloodletting. And trust me, this next part is going to make you very, very grateful you live in the 21st century. Vienna, December 5th, 1791. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart lies in bed burning with fever. He's only 35 years old, at the height of his musical genius, and he's dying. His doctor arrives and makes a decision that in his mind is the most scientifically sound treatment available. He orders Mozart's blood to be drained again because they'd already done it multiple times during this illness. Mozart is weak, pale as parchment, barely able to speak, and they cut into his veins and let more of his life pour out into a basin. Some historians believe that bloodletting, not his mysterious illness, is what actually killed Mozart. That without this treatment, his body might have fought off whatever infection or kidney disease was attacking him. But his doctors, educated at the finest universities in Europe, following the most respected medical texts of their time, drained away the very thing his body needed most to survive. Welcome to bloodletting, medicine's longest-running, deadliest mistake. Now, I want you to understand something important before we go further into this darkness. The doctors who practiced bloodletting weren't sadists. They weren't trying to hurt people. In their minds, they were performing a life-saving procedure backed by 2,000 years of medical wisdom. They believed, truly believed, that they were draining away sickness itself, that corrupted blood was the enemy, and removing it would restore health. They were wrong, catastrophically, tragically wrong. But they didn't know that. Let's talk about how this actually worked, because the details matter. There were 3 main techniques, each with its own tools and rituals. First, there was venesection, literally cutting into a vein, usually in the arm or neck. The doctor would tie a tourniquet above the cut to make the vein bulge, then use a sharp blade called a fleam or lancet to pierce the skin. Blood would flow into a bowl, sometimes for minutes, sometimes longer, while the doctor carefully watched the amount and quality of what came out. How much blood did they take? Well, that varied wildly. For a simple fever, maybe 8 to 12 ounces. For something considered serious, they might drain 20, 30, even 40 ounces. That's more than a liter, nearly a quarter of your total blood volume. And they'd often repeat this process multiple times over days or weeks. Imagine being sick, your body fighting an infection, desperately trying to heal itself, and having a quarter of your blood drained away every few days. Your immune system needs that blood. Your organs need that blood. Your brain needs that blood. But medieval doctors believed excess blood was poison. So away it went. The second technique was cupping. You've probably seen those strange circular marks on people's backs from modern cupping therapy. Well, medieval cupping was similar, but taken to horrifying extremes. They'd heat a glass or metal cup to create a vacuum, place it on the skin, and let it suction up. Sometimes this was just to draw blood to the surface, but often they'd make small cuts first, called scarification, and let the cups suck blood directly out through the wounds. A dozen cups across your back, each one pulling blood through deliberate cuts, leaving you looking like you've been attacked by some geometric vampire. And then there were the leeches. Oh, the leeches. Leeches were actually considered the gentler option, if you can believe that. These weren't random swamp leeches. There was actually a specific species, Hirudo medicinalis, the European medicinal leech, bred and sold specifically for bloodletting. Apothecaries kept them in jars, hundreds of them, writhing and waiting. When you needed treatment, the doctor would apply anywhere from 6 to 12 leeches to various parts of your body. Each leech could consume about a teaspoon of blood before dropping off fat and satisfied. The wounds would continue bleeding for hours afterward, sometimes losing several times more blood than the leeches themselves consumed. Here's something that'll make your skin crawl. For certain treatments, especially for eye problems or headaches, they'd apply leeches directly to your eyelids or inside your nostrils, or, and I'm not making this up, inside your mouth on your gums. Imagine lying there trying not to move while living creatures attach themselves to your most sensitive areas and slowly drain your blood. But here's what's really wild. People requested this. They believed in it. Wealthy folks would pay handsomely for regular bloodletting treatments like a modern wellness spa visit. Just feeling a bit sluggish? Better have some blood drained. It was preventative medicine. Better to drain a little blood regularly than wait until you were seriously ill, right? And this is where we need to talk about the barber-surgeons because they're a fascinating piece of this story. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, there was a strict hierarchy in medicine. At the top were university-educated physicians, men who studied Latin texts, wore fine robes, and generally didn't like getting their hands dirty with actual blood. Below them were surgeons who did practical procedures, but were considered more craftsmen than professionals. And at the bottom, running neighborhood shops all across Europe, were the barber-surgeons. These were the guys who'd cut your hair, shave your beard, pull your rotten teeth, set your broken bones, and yes, drain your blood. All in the same chair, probably with the same instruments. The famous red and white striped barber pole? That's actually a bloodletting symbol. Red for blood, white for the bandages, and the pole itself represents the staff patients would grip during the procedure to make their veins bulge. Every time you see one of those cheerful spinning poles outside a modern barber shop, you're looking at a remnant of medieval medical horror. Picture a typical barber-surgeon shop in London, say around 1500. You walk in and there's a chair in the middle, stained dark with old blood. Along the walls are razors, scissors, saws, pliers, bowls crusted with dried blood, jars of leeches, and probably a couple of teeth sitting on a shelf as trophies from successful extractions. The air smells like blood and unwashed bodies, and the herbs they burn to try to cover up the smell. The barber-surgeon is cheerful, chatty, telling you about his other customers while he sharpens his fleam on a leather strop. This is healthcare. This is normal. Let me tell you about George Washington because his death perfectly illustrates how bloodletting could turn a manageable illness into a tragedy. December 1799. Just 8 years after Mozart died, Washington wakes up with a sore throat and trouble breathing. Probably what we'd now call acute epiglottitis or a severe throat infection, completely treatable today with antibiotics and maybe a breathing tube. But Washington's doctors don't have antibiotics. What they have is their training in bloodletting. Over the course of about 12 hours, they drained approximately 40% of Washington's total blood volume. Let me repeat that, 40%. More than half a gallon of blood taken from a sick 67-year-old man. The doctors are doing what they believe is right. Washington's throat is inflamed. He's feverish. These are signs of excess blood. So they drain it and drain it and drain it. Washington, who'd survived countless battles, who'd led armies through impossible conditions, who'd helped birth a nation, died not from his illness, but from the treatment. One of his doctors later expressed doubt about the procedure. Just doubt. Not certainty that they'd made a mistake, but a tiny whisper of maybe we took too much blood. That's how powerful the belief in bloodletting was. Even watching it fail spectacularly, doctors couldn't fully abandon it. Now you might be wondering, did bloodletting ever help anyone? And here's where it gets psychologically interesting. Sometimes yes, but not for the reasons doctors thought. If someone fainted during bloodletting from blood loss and they had high blood pressure to begin with, the sudden drop might make them feel temporarily better. Look, the treatment worked. They felt faint and weak, but now their headache is gone. Well, yeah, severe blood loss does lower blood pressure. It also makes you dizzy and weak and more likely to die from infection, but hey, the headache's gone. Or consider someone with actual polycythemia, a rare condition where your body makes too many red blood cells. For those people, carefully removing some blood is actually therapeutic. We still do it today for that specific condition. But medieval doctors didn't know about polycythemia. They just knew that once in a while bloodletting seemed to help someone, and that was enough to reinforce their belief in the practice. This is called confirmation bias, and it's incredibly powerful. When bloodletting appeared to work, doctors remembered it and attributed it to their skill in balancing humors. When patients died, well, they were too far gone, or the stars weren't right, or God had called them home. The treatment itself was rarely blamed. The theory was always protected. And God did people suffer. There are documented cases of patients being bled weekly for chronic conditions. Imagine having epilepsy or migraines or arthritis, something that doesn't kill you, but makes life difficult. And every week someone cuts your arm open and drains a pint of blood. You're perpetually anemic, perpetually weak. Your immune system is shot. You catch every infection that passes through town. And all the while, your doctor is congratulating himself on keeping your humors balanced. Women especially were victims of this practice. Menstruation was seen as the body's natural bloodletting. So when women reached menopause and stopped bleeding monthly, doctors became concerned. They prescribed artificial bloodletting to compensate to prevent the retention of bad humors that would supposedly occur without regular blood loss. So postmenopausal women were routinely bled to simulate something their bodies had naturally stopped doing. The logic was airtight and completely backward. Here's a question for you. How many people do you think died from bloodletting throughout history? We'll never know the exact number, but we're talking about a practice that was standard treatment for over 2,000 years, prescribed for almost every ailment imaginable, performed millions of times, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. The human cost is almost impossible to calculate. And the darkly ironic thing is that doctors noticed patients often got worse after bloodletting. They became weaker, more susceptible to infection, slower to heal. But instead of questioning the treatment, they interpreted this as proof they hadn't drained enough blood. The corruption runs deeper than we thought. We must bleed them again. It's the same logic as the beatings will continue until morale improves. Bloodletting finally began to decline in the mid-1800s when doctors started doing something revolutionary: keeping statistics. A French physician named Pierre Louis studied the outcomes of pneumonia patients. Some treated with bloodletting, some not. And the numbers were undeniable. The ones who weren't bled survived at higher rates. Statistics don't care about elegant theories or ancient authority. They just show you what happens. And what happened was that bloodletting killed people. But even then, the practice didn't disappear overnight. Some doctors kept recommending it into the early 1900s. Think about that. There were people alive during World War I who remembered going to doctors who prescribed bloodletting. It's not ancient history. It's within living memory of people's great-grandparents. The legacy of bloodletting teaches us something profound about medicine, about human nature, really. It shows us how a logical-sounding but wrong idea can persist for millennia because we want to believe we can do something, anything, to fight disease and death. Doing nothing, which would often have been better, feels like giving up. So doctors bled their patients confident they were helping, unable to see that their treatment was often worse than the disease. And this brings us to a question that probably occurred to you already. If doctors couldn't see inside the body, couldn't understand what was really happening, how did they decide what was wrong with someone in the first place? What were they basing these catastrophic treatments on? Well, as we're about to discover, medieval diagnostic techniques were just as fascinating and disturbing as their treatments. They had their methods. Oh yes, elaborate systems for examining patients, for reading signs and symptoms, for supposedly determining exactly which humor was out of balance. But these methods required them to look at some very strange things, and sometimes to taste them. Yes, taste them. I warned you this was going to get weird. You know what's fascinating about the human mind? We crave certainty. When faced with the unknown, we'll invent elaborate systems to make sense of chaos, to convince ourselves we understand what we cannot see. And nowhere is this more evident than in how medieval doctors tried to diagnose disease without any ability to actually look inside the human body. They couldn't do blood tests, couldn't take x-rays, couldn't measure blood pressure or heart rate accurately, couldn't see bacteria under microscopes because microscopes didn't exist yet. So, what did they do? They became absolutely obsessed with the one bodily fluid they could easily collect and examine: urine. And I mean obsessed. If medieval medicine had a mascot, it wouldn't be a Red Cross or a caduceus. It would be a flask of pee. Let me take you inside a diagnostic examination. Say around 1400 somewhere in France. You're sick. Fever, weakness, pain in your side. You visit the local physician. He's an educated man studied at Montpellier, one of the great medical schools. He wears fine robes and carries an air of authority. And the first thing he asks you to do is fill a special flask, a matelas, with your urine, not just a quick sample. He wants the first morning urine if possible, collected in a clear glass vessel shaped like a bladder, wide at the bottom and narrow at the top. Now here's where it gets interesting. The doctor holds this flask up to the light, rotating it slowly, examining the contents like a wine connoisseur with a vintage Bordeaux. He's looking at color first, not just yellow or dark. No, medieval physicians recognized at least 20 different shades of urine, each supposedly indicating a different condition. There were elaborate diagrams called urine wheels that mapped these colors to specific diseases. The wheel would show everything from pale white urine, indicating an excess of phlegm and cold diseases, to deep black urine, which was basically a death sentence, supposedly showing that the body's humors were so corrupted that nothing could save the patient. There was cloud white urine, lemon yellow, gold, amber, red, greenish, brown. Each shade had meaning. Each variation told a story about which humor was unbalanced and where in the body the problem originated. But color was just the beginning. Next, the doctor examines the consistency. Is the urine thick or thin? Does it have sediment floating in it? Are there clouds or threads? Is it foamy? Medieval medical texts devoted entire chapters to sediment analysis. Thick white sediment supposedly indicated problems with phlegm. Reddish sediment suggested excess blood or bile. Black sediment, again, probably dying. Then comes the smell test. The doctor brings the flask close to his nose and inhales deeply. Sweet-smelling urine might indicate what we now know as diabetes. The glucose literally makes urine smell sweet, but the medieval doctor thinks it means an overheated liver or corrupted blood. Foul-smelling urine suggests putrefaction of humors requiring immediate bloodletting and purging. And then comes the part that makes modern people gag. The taste test. Yes, they tasted it with their actual mouths. This wasn't some rare, desperate measure. This was standard diagnostic procedure recommended in the most prestigious medical textbooks of the era. The doctor would dip a finger into your urine, touch it to his tongue, and assess the flavor. Sweet, salty, bitter. Each taste corresponded to different humoral imbalances. There's a wonderful, wonderful might be the wrong word, quote, from a 6th century physician named Cassiodorus who wrote, "For a skilled physician, the pulsing of the veins reveals to his fingers the patient's ailment, just as the appearance of urine indicates it to his eyes." Notice he says appearance, not taste. That's because by his time, doctors were already so associated with urine tasting that they didn't need to explicitly mention it. Everyone just knew. Imagine being that doctor. You've examined 30 patients today. You've tasted 30 different samples of urine. Your tongue is coated with the flavors of other people's metabolic waste. And you genuinely believe this is medicine. This is science. This is how you determine what's killing someone. The dedication is admirable. The reality is nauseating. Now here's the really wild part. Sometimes this accidentally worked. That diabetes diagnosis I mentioned. Medieval doctors consistently noted that some patients had sweet-tasting urine and insatiable thirst. They called it the honey urine disease. They didn't understand about insulin or blood sugar, but they recognized the pattern. Kidney stones. The sandy, gritty sediment in urine actually does indicate stone formation. Urinary tract infections. The foul smell and cloudy appearance are real signs of infection, even if the explanation was wrong. So, medieval uroscopy was a strange mixture of accurate observation and completely wrong interpretation. They saw real things, color changes, sediment, smell variations, and constructed an elaborate but incorrect theory to explain them. It's like building an enormous, beautiful castle on quicksand. The craftsmanship is impressive, but the foundation is doomed. But wait, there's more to medieval diagnosis than just urine. Because remember, these physicians believed the cosmos itself influenced human health. The position of the planets, the phase of the moon, the alignment of stars, all of this supposedly affected the balance of humors in your body. So no diagnosis was complete without consulting the heavens. Imagine that same doctor having examined your urine now pulling out astronomical charts. He asks, when were you born? What day? What time? Because your astrological sign determines your fundamental humoral nature. Born under Aries, you're naturally choleric, hot and dry, prone to fevers and anger. Born under Cancer, you're phlegmatic, cold and wet, susceptible to sluggishness and melancholy. But it's not just your birth chart. The doctor also needs to know the current positions of the planets because they influence when treatment should be administered. Mercury is in retrograde. Bad time for bloodletting. Full moon excellent for purging medicines because the moon's pull affects bodily fluids just like it affects tides. Mars in conjunction with Saturn. Expect increased inflammation and choleric disorders. This wasn't considered superstition. This was medical science. Universities taught medical astrology as a core subject. Physicians who didn't consult the stars before treatment were considered reckless, even negligent. There are documented cases of doctors being sued for malpractice because they administered treatment during an astrologically unfavorable time. Let me give you a specific example. It's 1348. Yes, that's when the Black Death hits, but we'll get to that catastrophe soon. And a physician in Italy is treating a patient with a tumor. He consults his charts and determines that Mars is in the house of Aries, which governs the head and upper body. This is considered a dangerous time for any surgical intervention in that area, so he waits. Days pass, the tumor grows, the patient weakens. But the doctor is waiting for Venus to enter the ascendant, which supposedly will create favorable conditions for surgery. By the time the stars align properly, the patient has deteriorated so much that surgery is impossible. They die, and the doctor records in his journal, treatment delayed by unfavorable celestial arrangements. Patient expired before optimal intervention possible. The stars killed that patient as surely as any tumor. Think about the tragic absurdity of this. Doctors spending years learning to read astronomical charts, calculating planetary positions with mathematical precision, consulting elaborate tables, all to decide when to apply treatments that didn't work in the first place. Imagine the combined brain power, the scholarly dedication, the sheer intellectual effort poured into this system that was sophisticated, complex, internally consistent, and utterly divorced from reality. And the moon. Oh, the moon got special attention. Medieval physicians believed the moon governed all fluids, tides, yes, but also blood, phlegm, bile, even the humors themselves. During a full moon, humors were supposedly more active, more likely to overflow and cause disease. New moon meant humors were sluggish, requiring stimulation. The second quarter was ideal for bloodletting. The fourth quarter was best for purgatives. There are detailed medical calendars from this period. Beautifully illustrated manuscripts showing the zodiac man, a human figure with each body part connected to an astrological sign. Aries governs the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on down to Pisces controlling the feet. Doctors used these to determine where in the body problems originated based on planetary positions. Cut open someone's arm to drain blood while the moon is in Gemini. Perfectly sound medical practice. Try the same thing when the moon is in Scorpio. Medical malpractice. Can you imagine a modern doctor saying, "Well, I'd like to treat your pneumonia, but Mercury is in retrograde, so let's wait 2 weeks." You'd think they'd lost their mind, but that was completely normal, expected, required medical practice for over 1,000 years. Here's a question that probably occurred to you. Did any medieval doctors doubt this system? Did anyone look at the urine wheel and astronomical charts and think, "Wait, this is insane"? Some did. There are occasional references in medical texts to physicians who questioned whether star positions really affected disease. But they were rare, and they were usually ignored or ridiculed. The system was too deeply entrenched, too thoroughly taught at universities, too protected by authority and tradition. Questioning astrological medicine was like questioning gravity. Why would you doubt something so obviously true? And the tragic irony, while doctors were tasting urine and charting planetary movements, actual treatable conditions went undiagnosed. A simple bacterial infection was interpreted as a Jupiter-Venus conjunction affecting the melancholic humor. An easily treatable kidney stone became a crystallization of excess yellow bile, requiring weeks of useless herbal treatments. Appendicitis was diagnosed as an imbalance of hot and cold humors requiring, you guessed it, bloodletting, which made everything worse. The tools were wrong, the theories were wrong, the timing was wrong. Everything that seemed so logical, so scientifically rigorous to medieval minds was a castle built on fog. But you know what's truly terrifying? All of these diagnostic mistakes, all of these wrong theories, all of this misdirected effort, none of it mattered when the real nightmare arrived. Because in 1347, a disease appeared that made every medical theory, every urine analysis, every astrological chart completely catastrophically irrelevant. The Black Death was coming, and when it arrived, medieval doctors armed with all their flasks and charts and scholarly training were about to face their ultimate test. A test they would fail so spectacularly, so completely, that the very foundations of medieval medicine would begin to crack. So take a breath, maybe get some water, because what comes next is the darkest chapter in this entire story. The moment when doctors realized that all their knowledge, all their techniques, all their certainty about how the human body worked counted for nothing against an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't stop. October 1347, the port of Messina, Sicily. 12 Genoese trading ships limp into harbor, returning from the Black Sea. The dock workers rushed to greet them, expecting exotic goods from the east. Silks, spices, perhaps precious metals. Instead, they find something that will kill half of Europe. Most of the sailors are already dead, their bodies twisted and black with swollen buboes. The ones still alive are delirious, burning with fever, coughing blood, begging for help. The harbor master orders the ships out of port immediately, but it's too late. Death has already stepped ashore, and medieval medicine is about to face its apocalypse. Within 5 years, the Black Death will kill somewhere between 75 and 200 million people, roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population. To put that in perspective, imagine walking down a street in your town and every other person you see just disappears, gone, dead within days of the first symptoms. That's what Europe experienced. And the doctors, the learned physicians with their urine flasks and astrological charts and humoral theories, they were utterly, completely, devastatingly helpless. Let me tell you about a physician named Guy de Chauliac. He's one of the most famous surgeons of the medieval period practicing in Avignon, the papal seat during the height of the plague. And he kept a journal. It's one of the most haunting documents from the era because you can feel his growing desperation, his confusion, his realization that everything he'd learned, everything he believed about medicine was useless against this enemy. Guy writes, "The mortality began with us in January 1348. It was of two kinds. The first lasted 2 months with continuous fever and spitting of blood, and people died of it in 3 days. The second lasted for the rest of the period also with continuous fever but with abscesses and carbuncles on the external parts, principally on the armpits and groin. People died of it in 5 days. You can hear him trying to categorize it to fit it into his understanding. Pneumonic plague and bubonic plague. He's observing 2 different manifestations of the same disease, though he doesn't know that. He just knows that people are dying and nothing he does stops it. So, what did medieval doctors try? Everything. Absolutely everything in their arsenal. And then some desperate innovations that showed just how panicked they were. First, of course, bloodletting. They bled plague patients aggressively, thinking the fever and inflammation indicated excess blood. Imagine you're already dying from a bacterial infection that's overwhelming your immune system. Your lymph nodes are swelling to the size of eggs. You're in agony, and then a doctor cuts your arm open and drains a pint of blood. It's hard to think of anything that could make your chances of survival worse, but they found a way. They also lanced the buboes, those horrible swollen lymph nodes, cutting them open to drain the corrupted humors. This was done without anesthesia, without antibiotics, often with unsterilized instruments. The pain was indescribable, and the risk of secondary infection was enormous. Some patients actually died from the treatment itself rather than the plague. But here's where it gets truly bizarre, where you see medieval medicine spinning completely out of control, grasping at anything that might work. Doctors prescribed burning aromatic herbs, rosemary, juniper, cypress, believing the sweet smoke would purify the pestilential atmosphere. Rich people carried posies of flowers held constantly to their noses. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies. Yes, that cheerful children's rhyme is actually about the plague. The rosy is the circular rash. The posies are the flowers to ward off disease. And ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Well, that's what happened. They all fell down dead. Some physicians recommended bathing in vinegar or rose water. Others insisted the opposite, that bathing was dangerous because it opened the pores and let pestilence in. There are records of doctors declaring that olive oil as food is fatal and that water should be avoided entirely. Imagine being desperately thirsty from fever and your doctor telling you not to drink water because it might kill you. One theory held that the air itself had become stiff and needed to be broken up. How? By loud noises. I'm not kidding. In some towns, church bells were rung constantly, cannons were fired, people were encouraged to shout and make noise to shatter the corrupted air. The sound must have been deafening and completely useless. The plague kept killing regardless of volume. Then there's the theory about eye contact. One doctor wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, "Instantaneous death occurs when the aerial spirit escaping from the eyes of the sick man strikes the healthy person standing near." They believed you could catch plague just by making eye contact with someone infected. So people walked around averting their gaze, afraid to look at each other, adding psychological isolation to physical suffering. And the explanations for why this was happening, they range from almost reasonable to absolutely insane. The most scientific explanation was corrupted air. Miasma caused by earthquakes or volcanic eruptions that had supposedly occurred before the plague appeared. Never mind that no such geological events had actually happened. The theory needed a cause, so they invented one. Astrologically inclined physicians blamed a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345. The planets aligned, corrupted the air, and boom, plague. This explanation was so widely believed that the medical faculty at the University of Paris wrote an official report declaring it the definitive cause. The most prestigious medical minds in Europe, all agreeing on something completely wrong. Religiously, many saw it as divine punishment for sin. This led to one of the most disturbing responses, the Flagellants. These were groups of people who traveled from town to town publicly whipping themselves with leather straps studded with metal. They believed that by inflicting pain on themselves, by repenting dramatically and bloodily, they could appease God's anger and end the plague. Picture a town square in Germany, 1349. A procession of men arrives, stripped to the waist, their backs already crisscrossed with scars from previous beatings. They form a circle and begin to whip themselves, chanting prayers, blood running down their backs. Crowds gather to watch, some joining in. They do this for hours, sometimes days, then move to the next town, spreading, ironically, more disease as they go. Because those whips and those open wounds, perfect vectors for infection. The Flagellants thought they were the cure. They were actually part of the problem. But can you blame them? When doctors offered no hope, when medicine failed completely, People turned to religion, to superstition, to anything that gave them a sense of control over the uncontrollable. And the doctors themselves, many fled. Guy de Chauliac admitted this in his journal. It was so contagious that not only by staying together, but even by looking at one another, people caught it. And I was afraid to visit the sick, lest I should be infected and die. This is a papal physician, one of the best trained doctors in Europe, basically saying, "I'm too scared to do my job." Other doctors refused to see patients outright. Priests refused to administer last rites. Shopkeepers closed their stores. Entire families were abandoned when the first member showed symptoms. The social fabric just disintegrated. Because when you don't understand contagion, when you can't treat a disease, when watching people die is your only option, fear overwhelms everything else, including duty. Here's something most people don't know. The Black Death may have been the first instance of biological warfare in recorded history. During the siege of Kaffa, a Genoese trading post in Crimea in 1346, the attacking Mongol army was devastated by plague. So what did they do with their dead? They catapulted the corpses over the city walls. The Genoese fled by ship, those same ships that arrived in Messina in 1347, carrying the disease with them. Whether the siege actually caused the spread or whether it would have happened anyway, we can't know for sure. But the intent was there. Weaponized death itself. The plague spread with terrifying speed from Messina to Marseille, to Florence, to Paris, to London, following trade routes, following human contact, moving faster than any army. By mid-1348, less than a year after arriving in Sicily, the Black Death had struck every major European city: Paris, London, Bordeaux, Lyon. By 1351, it had reached Scandinavia and Russia. Nowhere was safe. The death tolls are almost incomprehensible. Florence lost between 50,000 and 60,000 people, more than half its population. Venice lost 60%. Paris maybe 50,000 dead. London, some estimates say 40,000 to 50,000. Small villages were completely wiped out, entire families dead within a week. There weren't enough people alive to bury the dead. Bodies were piled in mass graves, hundreds at a time, covered with lime and dirt. And through all of this, all this death, all this suffering, medieval medicine had exactly 0 effective treatments. Not one. Everything they tried either did nothing or made things worse. The 4 humors, irrelevant, bloodletting, harmful, astrological timing, meaningless aromatic herbs, false comfort. They were fighting an invisible bacterial enemy with tools designed for an imaginary war against unbalanced fluids. But here's what haunts me most about this period: the psychological toll on the doctors themselves. Imagine dedicating your life to healing, studying for years, accumulating all this knowledge, being respected in your community, and then watching patient after patient die despite your best efforts. Watching the fear in their eyes as you examine them, knowing you can't help. Watching families beg you to save their children and knowing you can't. Feeling the weight of every failure, every death, every accusation that maybe you're not skilled enough, not learned enough, not favored enough by God. Some doctors had nervous breakdowns. Others became fatalistic, going through the motions of treatment while knowing it was futile. Some turned to drink or abandoned medicine entirely. And a very few, began to question whether everything they'd been taught was wrong. But those voices were drowned out by the screaming, the dying, the endless tolling of funeral bells. Guy de Chauliac survived the plague. He continued practicing medicine for years afterward. But his journal entries from that period are different, less confident, more uncertain. He'd seen the limits of his knowledge laid bare. He'd watched medicine fail on a civilizational scale, and he could never quite believe in it the same way again. The Black Death eventually subsided, though it returned in waves for centuries, but it left scars on medieval society that never fully healed. And it planted seeds of doubt about medieval medicine that would eventually grow into the scientific revolution. Because when your entire medical system fails so spectacularly, so publicly, so catastrophically, eventually someone has to ask, what if we've been wrong about everything? But that questioning wouldn't come for a while yet. Because in the wake of the plague's horror, when people had watched nearly everyone they loved die despite the doctor's best efforts, when traditional medicine had proven utterly useless, desperation set in. And desperate people do desperate things. Horrible things. Things that seem impossible to believe until you understand just how much they feared death, how desperately they wanted to cheat it, how far they were willing to go. And some of those things involved consuming death itself, literally. I'm talking about corpses, about human remains used as medicine, about cannibalism disguised as healing. It's the darkest, most disturbing chapter in this story, and it's where we're heading next. There's a pharmacy in 17th century London. Not a modern drugstore. Imagine a shop with wooden shelves lined with jars and bottles, each carefully labeled. Most contain what you'd expect: herbs, minerals, oils extracted from plants. But some jars hold something else. They're labeled Mumia, or Spiritus Humanus, or moss from human skull. And inside ground-up human remains, bones, flesh, blood, pieces of the dead, preserved and packaged and sold as medicine. Welcome to corpse medicine, the practice that makes bloodletting look humane by comparison. And before you think this was some fringe superstition practiced by backwards villagers, let me be clear. This was mainstream, respectable, physician-prescribed medicine. The royal families of Europe consumed it. The wealthy paid premium prices for it. Medical textbooks recommended it. For centuries, eating the dead to avoid becoming dead yourself was considered perfectly rational. How did this happen? How did cannibalism become medicine? It starts with an idea that once you hear it has a certain terrible logic to it. Medieval people believed in something called vital force, a life energy that animated the body, the thing that made you you rather than just meat and bones. And they believed this force didn't immediately disappear when someone died. It lingered in the body, especially in certain parts: the blood, the bones, the skull, the fat. So, if you consume these parts, you'd absorb some of that vital force. You'd be taking in someone else's life energy, their strength, their vitality. It's like they thought life was transferable, that you could download someone else's essence by literally eating them. And when you're desperate, when you're dying, when conventional medicine has failed, when you'll try anything, this starts to sound almost reasonable. The practice has ancient roots. Egyptian mummies were the luxury version of corpse medicine. European traders had been importing ground-up mummies from Egypt since at least the 12th century, selling the powder for astronomical prices. Why mummies specifically? Because they'd been preserved for thousands of years, their life force supposedly concentrated and potent through the embalming process. Plus, they were exotic, mysterious, associated with ancient wisdom. If you were rich and dying in 1500, someone might prescribe you Mumia, literally powdered Egyptian mummy mixed into wine or honey. But here's the dark truth. Demand far exceeded supply. Real Egyptian mummies were expensive and hard to come by. So enterprising merchants created fake mummies. They'd take recently dead bodies, sometimes from executed criminals, sometimes from hospitals, sometimes from, well, let's just say the sourcing was questionable. Dry them in the sun, cover them in pitch, age them a bit, and sell them as ancient Egyptian mumia. Customers couldn't tell the difference. They were drinking ground-up strangers, thinking they were consuming pharaohs. And mummy powder was just the beginning. Let me walk you through the pharmaceutical catalog of human remains, because the specificity is what makes this so disturbing. For epilepsy, a condition that terrified medieval people because it seemed like demonic possession, the prescription was fresh human blood. Not just any blood. It had to be warm, ideally taken from someone who just died violently. So, epileptic patients or their families would attend public executions, cup or cloth in hand, ready to catch the blood before the body cooled. Imagine standing in a crowd watching someone's head get cut off and then rushing forward with a jug to collect the blood because your doctor told you it would cure your seizures. This wasn't rare. This was common. Executioners sometimes sold access, charging fees for people to get close enough to collect blood. It became a grim business transaction. Good morning. I'm here for the beheading. Yes, I'll take a pint of fresh blood, please. For headaches and migraines, the recommended treatment was moss scraped from human skulls. Not just any skulls. They had to be from people who died violently, whose life force had been suddenly interrupted rather than slowly fading. Graveyards and execution sites were harvested for this skull moss. People would literally scrape lichen off of dead people's heads, dry it, grind it up, and consume it. For gout and joint pain, doctors prescribed oil made from boiled human bones. They take bones, again, preferably from executed criminals or accident victims. Boil them down to extract the marrow and fat, then bottle the resulting oil. Patients would rub this on their aching joints or sometimes drink it, believing the vital force in the bones would strengthen their own. Human fat was considered especially valuable for treating wounds and muscle aches. There are documented records of body fat being harvested from corpses, rendered down like you'd render lard from a pig, and sold as human grease. It was applied topically supposedly to transfer the life force directly to damaged tissue. And here's where it gets into truly horrifying territory: the doctrine of signatures. This was a philosophical belief that, like cures like that, substances resembling body parts could treat ailments in those parts. So skull fragments for head injuries, ground-up bone for broken bones, human fat for muscle problems, blood for blood disorders. It created this grotesque matching system: identify the problem, find the corresponding human part, consume it. The psychology behind this is fascinating and sad. When your child is having seizures, when your joints hurt so badly you can't work, when you've got a wound that won't heal, and conventional medicine offers nothing helpful, someone offers you a cure. It's disturbing, yes, but it's also hope. And hope is powerful enough to make people do things they'd never otherwise consider. There's a documented case from 1492 when Pope Innocent VIII was dying. The best physicians in Rome, desperate to save him, recommended blood transfusion, which they didn't know how to do properly. So instead, they had him drink the blood of 3 young boys. The boys were paid for their blood. All 3 died. The Pope died anyway. But this shows you how mainstream this practice was. The highest levels of the church, the most educated physicians in Europe, all agreeing that drinking children's blood might cure the Pope. Now, who are these donors? Where did all this human material come from? That's where it gets even darker. The wealthy bought Egyptian mummies or paid for fresh blood from executions. But poorer people couldn't afford those options, so they'd haunt graveyards, rob fresh graves, or wait by accident sites. There are records of people being arrested for grave robbery, their defense being, "I needed medicine." Executed criminals were particularly valuable. Their deaths were sudden and violent, meaning, according to theory, their life force was still strong. Their blood was fresher than mummy powder, and since they were criminals, using their bodies seemed morally acceptable. It was punishment extended beyond death. Not only would you be executed, but your body would be consumed by the society you'd wronged. Your death would literally nourish your victims. But think about what this means. It means a market in human body parts. It means people with financial incentive to harvest corpses. It means families of executed criminals might sell their relatives' remains. It means grave robbing became almost respectable if you claimed medical purposes. The entire system was macabre capitalism at its finest or worst. And did any of it work? Well, here's the thing. No, obviously not. Drinking blood doesn't cure epilepsy. Consuming powdered bone doesn't heal fractures. Rubbing human fat on your joints doesn't cure gout. There's no such thing as transferable life force. The entire premise was wrong. But, and this is important, sometimes patients improved anyway because bodies heal themselves given time, because the placebo effect is incredibly powerful, because some conditions are cyclical with natural periods of remission. So occasionally someone would consume corpse medicine, then get better, and that would reinforce the belief. I drank executed criminals' blood, and my seizures stopped. Well, maybe your seizures stopped because they were going to stop anyway. But causation and correlation are easily confused, especially when you're desperate to believe. The practice started declining in the 17th and 18th centuries. As medicine slowly became more scientific, physicians began questioning whether anatomical parts could really transfer qualities. The Royal Society in London conducted experiments, yes, actual experiments, testing whether corpse medicine worked. Spoiler alert, it didn't. But even then, the practice didn't disappear overnight. You could still buy mummy powder in European pharmacies into the 1900s. There are photographs from the early 20th century showing apothecary jars labeled Mumia. What finally killed corpse medicine wasn't moral outrage. People had been horrified by it for centuries, but kept using it anyway. What killed it was better alternatives. When modern chemistry developed actual pain relievers, actual seizure medications, actual treatments that worked reliably, corpse medicine became unnecessary. Why drink blood when you can take a pill that actually helps? But the ghost of corpse medicine lingers in some unexpected places. The phrase, good to the last drop, was originally used to describe extracted essences of medicine, including human-based ones. When we talk about consuming someone's work or being hungry for knowledge, we're using metaphors that corpse medicine took literally. Language preserves these shadows of practices we've forgotten or prefer not to remember. And here's what strikes me most about this whole grim chapter. The people who practiced corpse medicine weren't evil. They were scared. They were hurting. They were desperate to help their sick children, to cure their own pain, to stave off death just a little longer. When someone you love is dying and a respected physician tells you that consuming this powder might save them, wouldn't you at least consider it? Even if it disgusted you, even if it violated every instinct? That's the tragedy underneath the horror. These weren't monsters. They were just people equipped with wrong information, trying desperately to fight death with whatever tools they had, even if those tools were other people's remains. But there's one figure who took this obsession with death-defying medicine further than anyone else. A physician who didn't just prescribe corpse medicine. He claimed to have perfected it. He created pills that supposedly contained the essence of life itself. Pills that could cure anything. Pills that could, he boasted, literally wake the dead. His name was Paracelsus. And his story is where medieval medicine's desperate war against death reaches its most audacious, most bizarre, and strangest of all, most influential peak. Because this sword-wielding, opium-carrying, authority-burning Renaissance man didn't just practice medicine, he tried to reinvent it entirely. And his resurrection pills, well, they're about to blow your mind. Imagine a man walking into a university lecture hall in 1527 carrying a sword. Not decorative, a real sword, sharpened, deadly. The medical students whisper nervously. The professors look scandalized. And then this man, wild-haired, controversial, absolutely furious, starts his lecture not by reading from ancient texts like every respectable physician does, but by pulling out books by Galen and Avicenna, the foundations of all medieval medicine, and setting them on fire right there in the classroom. His name is Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. Yes, that's his real name, but he calls himself Paracelsus, meaning equal to or greater than Celsus, basically declaring himself better than one of the greatest Roman physicians. And you know what? He might have been, or he might have been, completely insane, possibly both. This is the man who claimed he could wake the dead. And to understand how someone could make that claim with a straight face, you need to understand Paracelsus himself, because he's unlike any figure we've encountered so far in this story. Born in 1493 near Zurich, Switzerland, Paracelsus grew up in a world still dominated by medieval medical thinking. His father was a physician. So young Theophrastus learned medicine early. But he wasn't content to just memorize ancient texts like everyone else. He traveled extensively throughout Europe into North Africa, possibly as far as the Middle East. He studied with alchemists, with miners who understood metals and minerals, with folk healers and wise women, and anyone who had practical knowledge of how substances affected the body. And he came to a radical conclusion. The ancient authorities were wrong about almost everything. Now remember, this is the early 1500s. Medicine is still based entirely on those Greek and Roman texts we talked about earlier. Universities teach Galen as gospel. Questioning these authorities isn't just unconventional. It's borderline heresy. But Paracelsus doesn't just question them. He declares open war. That sword I mentioned, it's actually part of his medical philosophy. The sword has a hollow pommel, that round bit at the end of the handle. And inside, Paracelsus keeps his most prized medicine, laudanum. He invented it himself, though the version he created was very different from the laudanum that would become popular centuries later. And he carries it in his sword because, well, why not? Maximum drama. Plus, he's traveling through dangerous Renaissance Europe. So, the sword has practical purposes too. But let's talk about those pills, the ones that supposedly could wake the dead. We have a description from one of Paracelsus's students, a man named Johannes Operinus, who lived and worked with him. And Operinus, in a letter written years later, describes these pills in unflattering terms. He writes that they looked like pieces of mouse droppings, literally small, dark, pellet-shaped pills that Paracelsus called laudanum, meaning worthy of praise. And what was in these miracle pills? Hold on to your seat, because the ingredient list is wild. About 25% opium. That's the base. But Paracelsus didn't stop there. He added powdered mummy, bezoar stones from cow digestive tracts, henbane, which is both a sedative and hallucinogenic plant, amber, crushed pearls, crushed coral, musk, oil from bone extracted from a stag's heart, and unicorn horn. Now, unicorn horn obviously didn't exist. What people sold as unicorn horn was usually narwhal tusk, or rhinoceros horn ground into powder. Paracelsus knew this probably, but used it anyway because the mystique was powerful. And occasionally, just to mix things up, he'd throw in frog spawn or orange juice or whatever else seemed alchemically significant at the moment. The result was this weird, potent concoction that definitely did something mainly because of the 25% opium content. Opium is a powerful painkiller and sedative. So when Paracelsus gave these pills to dying patients, yeah, they felt better. The pain stopped. They slipped into peaceful unconsciousness. Sometimes they even recovered if their illness was mild and primarily causing pain. And Paracelsus, watching this, concluded, "I can wake the dead." Operinus specifically recorded that Paracelsus boasted he could, with these pills, wake up the dead, not help dying people feel better, not ease their pain, wake the dead like Lazarus, like Christ himself. Was it delusion, showmanship, both? Paracelsus genuinely seemed to believe his medicines had near miraculous powers. And to be fair, compared to most medieval treatments, his pills probably did seem miraculous. If you're used to doctors draining your blood and making you worse, and then this eccentric guy with a sword gives you a pill that actually makes your pain stop, well, that is kind of miraculous. But Paracelsus's ambitions went far beyond pain relief. He was obsessed with the alchemical quest for the elixir of life, a substance that could extend life indefinitely, cure all diseases, maybe even grant immortality. And he thought he'd found it. Drinkable gold. This wasn't metaphorical. Paracelsus literally believed that gold, that incorruptible metal that never rusts, never decays, could transfer its properties to the human body. So he developed a formula for gold chloride, a liquid form of gold that could be consumed. He called it aurum potabile, drinkable gold. And he wrote that it would cure all illnesses, renew and restore, and make the body indestructible. Think about the promise there. Indestructible. Not just healthy, literally indestructible. Immune to disease, to aging, to death itself. He was claiming to have solved the fundamental problem of human existence. And he prescribed this to patients confident it would work. The reality, gold chloride is extremely toxic. It causes kidney damage, something called auric fever, excessive salivation, chronic urination, and sweating. Patients who took drinkable gold didn't become immortal. They became sick in entirely new and interesting ways. But Paracelsus saw some patients survive, probably because they were young and healthy to begin with, and took that as confirmation of gold's life-giving properties. Here's the deeply ironic part. Paracelsus promised his patients hundreds of years of life. He talked about living as long as the biblical patriarchs, 300 years, like Methuselah. And how long did Paracelsus himself live? He died in 1541 at age 47 or 48. Accounts vary. Some say it was a fall. Some say he was thrown out of a window by angry rivals. Some whisper he was poisoned by jealous physicians or apothecaries whose livelihoods he'd threatened with his radical ideas. But the most likely explanation? His own medicines probably contributed to his early death. All that opium, all those toxic metals he experimented with, all that drinkable gold, these things add up. The man who claimed to have conquered death couldn't even make it to 50. And yet, and this is important, Paracelsus wasn't entirely wrong about everything. In fact, he got some things remarkably right, which is what makes him such a fascinating figure. He was wrong about the magical properties of his pills, wrong about drinkable gold, wrong about being able to wake the dead. But he was right about some fundamental things that would eventually transform medicine. He insisted on careful observation over ancient authority. He said, "I am not to be judged by the universities. They must be judged by me." Arrogant, absolutely, but also necessary. Someone needed to say, maybe these 1,500-year-old books are wrong. He pioneered the use of chemicals and minerals in medicine. Before Paracelsus, medicine was primarily herbal. He introduced mercury, antimony, sulfur, lead. Used carefully, some of these actually work for specific conditions. Used carelessly, they're poison. Paracelsus often used them carelessly, but the principle was sound. He emphasized dose. He's famous for saying the dose makes the poison, the foundational principle of toxicology. Any substance can be medicine or poison depending on how much you take. This seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary then. It's why he's called the father of toxicology. And that laudanum. Despite the ridiculous ingredients Paracelsus added, the core idea opium tincture for pain relief actually worked. Later, physicians would simplify his formula, remove the pearls and mummy and frog spawn, and create effective pain medication that was used for centuries. So, Paracelsus was this strange mix of genuine insight and utter nonsense. He could be brilliant one moment, correctly identifying that minerals could treat disease, and completely delusional the next, claiming his pills could raise the dead. He was a visionary who saw past medieval dogma, but he replaced it with his own dogma that was often just as wrong. His teaching methods were as radical as his medicines. When he became a professor at the University of Basel briefly before they kicked him out, he lectured in German instead of Latin. This was scandalous. Latin was the language of educated people. German was for commoners. But Paracelsus said he wanted ordinary people to understand medicine, not just elite scholars. He wanted barber-surgeons and midwives and regular folks to access medical knowledge. Of course, he was also insufferably arrogant about it. He reportedly said things like, "My beard knows more than you and your scribes." He publicly mocked other physicians. He got into feuds constantly. When a prominent local magistrate's pharmacist refused to pay Paracelsus his full fee for treating the magistrate, Paracelsus sued, lost the case, and had to flee Basel in the middle of the night to avoid arrest. This is a pattern in his life. Arrive in a city, make bold claims, perform some impressive cures, anger everyone in the medical establishment, get kicked out or flee, move to the next city, repeat. He was brilliant, infuriating, visionary, wrong, right, and impossible to ignore. And people couldn't decide whether he was a genius or a charlatan. Some followed him devotedly, others despised him. Even centuries later, opinions are divided. Some medical historians revere him as the man who dragged medicine out of ancient dogma. Others see him as a dangerous quack who poisoned patients with toxic metals while claiming to have magical knowledge. Me. I think he was a deeply complicated man who genuinely wanted to help people, but was so convinced of his own genius that he couldn't see when he was wrong. His resurrection pills couldn't wake the dead any more than bloodletting could balance humors. But unlike the physicians who blindly followed Galen, Paracelsus at least tried something different. He failed often spectacularly, but he failed while reaching for something new. And that reaching, that refusal to accept that death was unbeatable, that obsession with finding cures, no matter how strange, that's the through line of our entire story. Medieval medicine failed again and again, but it never stopped trying. Paracelsus is the embodiment of that desperate, audacious, often disastrous attempt to cheat death itself. But while Paracelsus was mixing his resurrection pills and drinking gold, other physicians were trying equally strange approaches to defeating death and disease. Some of these methods were less toxic than Paracelsus's chemistry, but they were no less bizarre. And some of them involved drilling holes in people's skulls, or convincing them that kings could heal with a touch, or chasing uteruses around inside women's bodies. Yes, you heard that right, chasing uteruses. Because if you thought corpse medicine and resurrection pills were the strangest things medieval doctors did, just wait. We're about to explore treatments that make drinking blood seem almost rational by comparison. Sometimes the most absurd medical theories are the ones that persist longest. And nothing, absolutely nothing in medieval medicine is more absurd than the belief that a woman's uterus could get bored, pack its bags, and just wander around inside her body looking for something to do. I'm not exaggerating. For over 2,000 years, from ancient Greece through the medieval period and beyond, physicians genuinely believed that if a woman wasn't regularly pregnant, her uterus would become restless and start roaming through her torso like a discontented pet, causing hysteria, suffocation, and all manner of ailments as it bumped into other organs along the way. Plato described it as an animal within an animal. Hippocrates, yes, the same Hippocrates we keep coming back to, wrote that the uterus desired to create children, and without pregnancy, it would wander through the body seeking fulfillment. And medieval doctors reading these ancient texts nodded sagely and said, "Yes, this makes perfect sense." Just think about that for a moment. We've talked about bloodletting and corpse medicine and resurrection pills, all based on wrong theories, but at least theories that try to explain observable phenomena. But the wandering womb, this requires believing that a major organ can just take a stroll like it has a mind of its own. Tiny organ legs, maybe a little suitcase. I'm off to the lungs today, the pancreas tomorrow. See you around. But here's the thing. This wasn't fringe belief. This was mainstream gynecology, and it led to treatments that were invasive, degrading, and traumatizing for countless women. The logic, twisted as it was, went like this. A woman's uterus strongly desires to carry a fetus. If it's empty for too long, it becomes agitated. It might wander upward toward the heart and lungs, causing breathing difficulties and heart palpitations, what they called suffocation of the womb. Or it might move toward the head, causing headaches and mental disturbances, hysteria from the Greek word for uterus. And the treatment? Well, if the uterus had wandered too far up in the body, doctors needed to lure it back down. How? By making the upper body unpleasant and the lower body attractive. So they would place foul-smelling substances, sulfur, burning feathers, pitch under the woman's nose, and sweet-smelling substances, perfumes, pleasant herbs between her legs. The theory was that the uterus, repelled by bad smells and attracted to good ones, would literally migrate back to its proper position. Can you imagine being a woman in 1400? Going to a physician because you're anxious or having panic attacks? Maybe because life is difficult. Maybe because you're grieving. Maybe because you're stuck in an unhappy situation and being told that your uterus is wandering around inside you, and the cure is to have smoke blown under your nose while someone rubs fragrant oil on your thighs. The humiliation, the violation, and all based on anatomy that was completely invented. The prevention was even more disturbing. Get married young and have as many babies as possible. Medieval medical texts explicitly stated that regular pregnancy was the only way to keep the womb satisfied and stationary. So, women's reproductive choices were framed as medical necessities, not just social pressure. Actual medical advice that staying unmarried or childless would cause your organs to revolt. This theory persisted so long, partly because it explained away symptoms that doctors didn't understand. Anxiety, wandering womb, depression, wandering womb, seizures, wandering womb. Any psychological or neurological condition in a woman could be blamed on her allegedly mobile uterus. It was medical misogyny disguised as science, and it wouldn't be fully debunked until the 19th century. That's how powerful the ancient authorities were. But at least the wandering womb treatment, humiliating as it was, didn't involve sharp objects. Unlike trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in people's skulls. Now, skull drilling sounds medieval, but it's actually one of humanity's oldest surgical procedures. There's archaeological evidence of successful trepanation from 7,000 years ago. We know it was successful because the bone shows signs of healing, meaning patients survived. But by the medieval period, trepanation had become a go-to treatment for an alarming variety of conditions. Headaches, drill a hole. Epilepsy, drill a hole. Mental illness, drill a hole. Head injury, definitely drill a hole. The reasoning was that evil spirits, bad humors, or pressure needed to be released from the skull. Create an opening and the problem could escape. There's a fascinating medieval manuscript from 1345 by an Italian physician named Guido di Vigevano that contains detailed illustrations of trepanation procedures. The drawings show the patient sitting upright because anesthesia beyond maybe some wine or opium didn't really exist, while the surgeon applies a drill or specialized cutting tool called a trepan to their skull. The patient is conscious, awake, feeling everything. Try to imagine the sound, the scraping, grinding sensation as metal slowly bores through your skull bone. The smell of bone dust. The wet sound when the drill finally breaks through and touches the membrane covering your brain. Medieval surgeons had to be incredibly careful to penetrate the skull without puncturing the dura mater underneath, because that would almost certainly cause fatal infection or brain damage. And you know what's remarkable? Some patients survived. Not most. Infection rates were catastrophic, and many died from the procedure itself. But some survived, their skulls bearing these perfect circular holes that eventually scarred over. Archaeological digs have found medieval skeletons with multiple trepanation holes, meaning they survived the first procedure and came back for more. Whether this indicates the treatment worked or just shows how desperate people were, I can't say. But here's where medieval trepanation gets truly wild. They didn't just drill for medical reasons. Some people requested it as a preventative measure. Like bloodletting, trepanation was considered a way to maintain health by releasing pressure and bad humors before they cause problems. Can you imagine? Feeling fine. But I think I'll pop down to the barber surgeon and have him drill a hole in my head just to be safe. Speaking of preventative medicine, let's talk about the royal touch. Possibly the strangest cure we've encountered yet because it required no ingredients, no surgery, no procedure at all. Just the hand of a king. Throughout medieval Europe, but especially in England and France, kings were believed to have divine healing powers. Specifically, they could cure scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that causes swollen, infected lymph nodes in the neck. Why scrofula specifically? Nobody really knows. But it became known as the king's evil, and the cure was literally to be touched by royalty. This wasn't occasional. This was institutionalized. Kings held regular healing ceremonies where hundreds, sometimes thousands of sick people would line up for hours waiting for their turn to be touched. King Charles II of England, who reigned from 1660 to 1685, reportedly touched over 90,000 people during his reign. That's averaging about 10 people per day, every day for 25 years. Picture the scene. Westminster Palace, a grand ceremonial room. The king sits on his throne, dressed in royal finery. A long line of sick people, men, women, children, stretches out the door and into the street. One by one, they approach, kneel, and the king places his hands on their swollen necks. Sometimes he'd also give them a special coin, a touch piece that they could wear as a protective amulet. And did it work? Well, here's the interesting part. Scrofula is caused by tuberculosis bacteria, and mild cases can sometimes spontaneously resolve as the immune system fights off the infection. So occasionally someone touched by the king would actually get better. Not because of the touch, but because their body was going to heal anyway. But that's all you need to reinforce belief in the system. One success story is worth 100 failures when you're desperate for miracles. The psychological component was powerful too. Imagine you've traveled for days to see the king. You've waited hours in line. You've built up this moment in your mind as your salvation. When the king finally touches you, your brain releases endorphins. Your stress decreases. And especially if your condition was partly psychosomatic or stress-related, you might actually feel better. The placebo effect strikes again, but for serious bacterial infections, for actual tuberculosis, the royal touch did nothing. Patients died anyway, their necks still swollen, their lymph nodes still infected. But now, with the added trauma of having traveled hundreds of miles and been disappointed by divinity itself. The practice finally died out in the 18th century as medicine became more scientific and monarchs became less comfortable claiming divine healing powers. The last English monarch to practice it was Queen Anne in the early 1700s. And you know who she touched as a child? Samuel Johnson, the famous writer and dictionary compiler. He had scrofula. The Queen touched him. It didn't work. He carried the scars his entire life and later became one of the skeptics who helped demolish the belief in royal healing. But medieval doctors had one more trick in their arsenal that we need to talk about. And it's simultaneously the most merciful and most terrifying thing they did. Anesthesia. Because yes, they tried to develop ways to make surgery less agonizing. They just did it with a potion that could easily kill you. It was called dwale, and it was essentially a medieval anesthetic. The recipe varied, but a typical formula included pig bile, opium, lettuce, hemlock juice, vinegar, and several other herbs. All of this was mixed together and usually combined with large amounts of wine when it was time to administer it. Let's break down why this is insane. Opium. Okay, that's actually a good sedative. Lettuce contains mild sedative compounds. Actually not crazy, but hemlock. That's what killed Socrates. It's a powerful neurotoxin. And mixing it with opium, which is already a respiratory depressant, creates a combination that could very easily stop your breathing entirely. Medieval surgical patients had to make a terrible choice. Undergo surgery completely conscious, feeling every cut, every saw stroke, every moment of agony or drink dwale and risk never waking up. The surgery might be survivable, but the anesthetic might kill you before the surgeon even makes the first incision. And even if you survived the dwale, you'd wake up. If you woke up with no idea how much time had passed, what had been done to you, or whether you were healed or dying. There are scattered references in medical texts to patients who took dwale and simply never regained consciousness. Were they overdosed on hemlock? Did the opium suppress their breathing too much? Did they die from the surgery itself or the anesthetic? Medieval doctors couldn't always tell. This, perhaps more than anything, shows the impossible situation medieval medicine was in. They knew surgery was sometimes necessary. They knew it caused unbearable pain. They tried to develop solutions, but their solutions were almost as dangerous as the problems they were solving. They were fumbling in the dark, mixing poisons and hoping for the best, killing some patients to save others, always working at the very edge of what was possible with their limited knowledge. But here's what's remarkable. Despite all this, despite the skull drilling and the useless royal touches and the potentially lethal anesthetics, some medieval surgeons were actually good at their craft. Not good by modern standards, obviously, but astonishingly skilled given their limitations. They could amputate limbs and have patients survive. They could remove bladder stones. They could repair certain kinds of wounds with impressive success rates. And that brings us to the final paradox of medieval medicine. The same doctors who believed in wandering wombs and healing kings were also developing real surgical skills, real anatomical knowledge, real techniques that would eventually contribute to modern medicine. They were simultaneously making progress and going in circles, advancing and regressing, sometimes within the same procedure. So, as we near the end of our journey through medieval medicine's desperate attempts to cure death, we need to talk about these surgeons, the barber-surgeons and learned surgeons who worked without anesthesia, without antibiotics, without proper anatomical knowledge, and yet somehow managed to save lives. We need to understand what they got right even as they got so much wrong. Because their story, Their brutal, bloody, surprisingly successful story reveals something profound about human resilience. Both of the surgeons who performed these operations and the patients who survived them. And it's where all of medieval medicine's threads come together. The wrong theories, the desperate treatments, the occasional successes, and the slow, painful birth of something that would eventually become real medicine. So take a breath, maybe stretch a little, because what comes next involves saws and scalpels and operations performed on conscious patients who had nothing but a leather strap to bite down on. It's going to be intense, but it's also going to show you just how tough, how impossibly, incredibly tough both medieval surgeons and their patients had to be. There's a skeleton in a museum in London that tells an extraordinary story. It's from the 1400s, and the right femur, the thigh bone, shows clear evidence of a catastrophic injury. It was broken clean through, probably in battle, probably from a mace or warhammer. This should have been a death sentence. Infection, blood loss, shock. Any one of these should have killed this person within days. But look closer. The bone healed. Not perfectly. There's obvious deformity. The leg would have been shorter, but it healed. This person lived for decades after this injury. We know because there's arthritis in the knee joint above the break, the kind that takes years to develop. Someone somewhere in medieval Europe set this bone correctly, kept it immobilized, prevented infection, and saved this person's life without antibiotics, without x-rays, without proper anesthesia. They just did it. This is the paradox at the heart of medieval surgery. These surgeons believed in all the wrong things. Humors, wandering wombs, astrological timing. But their hands knew things their theories couldn't explain. And on battlefields, in desperate emergency situations, they developed skills that are genuinely impressive, even by modern standards. Let me take you to a battlefield in 1536. The French army is fighting in Italy, and a young military surgeon named Ambroise Paré is about to revolutionize surgery completely by accident. Paré is treating soldiers with gunshot wounds and sword cuts, and he's using the standard treatment of the time, boiling oil poured directly into wounds. Now, this treatment is exactly as horrible as it sounds. The theory was that gunpowder poisoned wounds and boiling oil would cauterize the tissue and burn out the poison. Soldiers would pass out from the pain. Many died from shock, but it was standard practice taught in every surgical manual. So Paré does it too, until one day in the chaos of battle he runs out of boiling oil. He's got dozens of wounded men and no oil left. So in desperation, he makes an ointment from egg yolks, oil of roses, and turpentine, basically whatever he has on hand, and applies that instead. Then he goes to bed, probably convinced that the men he treated without boiling oil will all be dead by morning because he couldn't use the proper treatment. The next day he makes his rounds, and here's what he finds. The soldiers treated with his improvised ointment are resting comfortably, their wounds showing early signs of healing, minimal inflammation. The ones treated with boiling oil in agony. Their wounds infected and suppurating many developing fevers. The evidence is undeniable. The traditional treatment is worse than doing almost nothing. Paré writes in his journal, "I resolved never again to burn so cruelly the poor wounded by gunshot." And he doesn't. He develops his gentle method of wound treatment, cleaning thoroughly, applying soothing ointments, keeping wounds covered with clean bandages. His survival rates skyrocket. Other surgeons notice slowly, painfully slowly, the practice of pouring boiling oil into wounds fades away. But Paré doesn't stop there. He also revives an ancient Greek technique that had been forgotten for centuries. Ligation tying off blood vessels during amputation. See, the medieval standard for amputation was cauterization. You'd saw off the limb, then sear the stump with a red-hot iron or boiling oil to seal the blood vessels. The pain was so intense that patients often died from shock before the procedure was even finished. Paré said, "What if we just tie off the arteries instead? Use thread to close the blood vessels, preventing bleeding without burning." It sounds so obvious now, but it was radical then, and it worked. Patients survived amputations at much higher rates. They could actually recover instead of spending weeks in agony from burn injuries on top of losing a limb. Here's the beautiful irony. Paré didn't understand why his methods worked better. He thought he was still balancing humors, just using gentler means. He didn't know about bacterial infection or the immune system or wound healing at a cellular level. He just knew that when you treat wounds gently, clean them carefully, and don't torture patients with boiling oil, they do better. Observation over theory, results over tradition. And Paré wasn't alone. Battlefield surgeons across Europe were developing real expertise because war, horrible as it is, provided endless practice. A surgeon in peacetime might do a handful of operations per year. A battlefield surgeon might do in a single day. You learn fast when lives depend on your speed and skill. They learn to remove arrows without causing more damage. A tricky procedure because medieval arrows often had barbed heads that would tear tissue if you just pulled them out. There are detailed manuscripts showing specialized instruments designed to grip the arrowhead and extract it cleanly. Sometimes they'd push the arrow all the way through if it was safer than pulling it back out. Brutal, but effective. They learned to identify which wounds were survivable and which weren't. Abdominal wounds that pierced the intestines, usually fatal. They didn't have antibiotics for the inevitable peritonitis, but chest wounds that missed major vessels. Those could heal. Limb wounds, often survivable if you acted fast. Medieval surgeons developed a kind of triage system, focusing their limited energy on patients they could actually save. They learned bone setting, and they got remarkably good at it. Archaeological studies of medieval skeletons consistently show broken bones that healed in good alignment. Fractures that were splinted properly, held immobile long enough to mend, resulting in functional limbs. Sometimes there's evidence of multiple healed fractures in the same skeleton, meaning these people survived serious injuries repeatedly and kept going. There's a technique described in medieval texts called the plaster cast. Not exactly like modern casts, but similar in principle. They'd set the broken bone, then wrap the limb in bandages soaked in egg whites, which would dry hard and keep everything immobile. It's ingenious. Egg white is basically protein, and when it dries, it forms a rigid shell. Add some splints for reinforcement, and you've got a functional cast. Did they understand the biochemistry? No. Did it work? Yes. For wound closure, they used egg whites. Again, the protein would help seal wounds and had some mild antiseptic properties they didn't understand. They'd also pour old wine over wounds, which we now know contains alcohol that kills bacteria. They thought they were balancing humors. They were actually practicing a primitive form of antisepsis. Let me tell you about Henri de Monville, a French surgeon who wrote a book called Chirurgia around 1306. It's one of the most detailed surgical manuals of the medieval period with illustrations showing step-by-step procedures. There are diagrams of how to perform amputations, how to remove bladder stones, a common and excruciatingly painful condition, how to treat head injuries, how to drain abscesses. The bladder stone procedure is particularly nightmarish. The patient would be held down. We're talking 5 or 6 strong men restraining them, while the surgeon made an incision in the perineum, manually located the stone inside the bladder by feel, and extracted it with specialized forceps. No anesthesia beyond maybe some wine. The pain was indescribable, but if successful, it cured a condition that otherwise meant a lifetime of agony every time you tried to urinate. Some patients chose the surgery despite knowing how horrible it would be, because living with bladder stones was somehow even worse. And here's something that shocked modern researchers. Success rates for some of these procedures were actually reasonable. Not great by modern standards. Maybe 50 to 70% survival for major surgeries depending on the procedure and the surgeon's skill. But considering they had no antibiotics, no blood transfusions, no proper anesthesia, no understanding of infection, that's remarkable. Why did any patient survive? Partly luck. Partly the fact that young, healthy patients and most surgical candidates were young because older, sicker people were considered too risky, can survive amazing trauma. Partly because some of these surgeons were genuinely skilled. They had steady hands, precise technique, years of experience. They might have believed nonsense about humors, but they knew anatomy from practice, even if they couldn't legally dissect corpses to study it formally. Oh, and speaking of dissection, here's an interesting bit of medieval medical politics. The Catholic Church was often blamed for banning anatomical dissection, but that's not quite accurate. The Church was concerned about proper burial and the resurrection of the dead. Remember that belief about needing an intact body to be resurrected, but they actually permitted some anatomical study for medical education. The real barrier was social. Dissecting human bodies was considered degrading work beneath the dignity of university-educated physicians. So who did the cutting? The surgeons. And this created a weird hierarchy. At the top,